The judge had barely finished looking through Mallorie and Rasit's prenup when the entire hearing suddenly went in a direction neither of them seemed prepared for, because instead of simply deciding who was right about the money, the judge started questioning whether this agreement should carry any weight at all, and that was the moment Rasit's confidence completely changed. He had walked into that room believing the paperwork protected him. Mallorie had walked in believing she was about to prove why those protections were unfair, but then one demand buried inside their argument opened a much bigger problem, because Mallorie was not simply asking for a payout if the marriage failed. She was claiming that she could end up giving up her independence, changing her entire life, becoming financially dependent during the marriage, and then potentially walking away with almost nothing if Rasit decided the relationship was over. Now that sounds dramatic enough, but what made this much worse was Rasit's reaction, because instead of saying that he understood why she wanted security, he immediately questioned why someone who was planning a happy marriage was already negotiating what she would receive after a divorce. And right there, before they even reached the most controversial part of the agreement, you could see exactly what this fight was really about. Mallorie believed she was protecting herself from being trapped, while Rasit believed Mallorie was preparing herself to leave, and somehow both of them were discussing marriage while sounding like they already expected it to collapse. What makes this situation so interesting is that Mallorie apparently did not arrive at the hearing saying that every part of the prenup was unacceptable because, according to her position, she had always understood why Rasit wanted financial boundaries. She was not demanding automatic ownership of everything he had before the relationship. She was not saying that every asset needed to become shared property, and she was not even arguing that a prenup itself meant that he did not trust her. Her problem was much more specific, because Mallorie believed the version they had originally discussed sounded balanced, while the document she later reviewed felt completely different once she started looking closely at what would actually happen if the relationship ended. That difference is important, because it is one thing to hear someone say, "We are both protecting ourselves," and another thing entirely to discover that one person keeps nearly everything they entered with, protects future financial growth, limits responsibility after separation, and still expects the other person to make major sacrifices during the relationship. Mallorie's argument was basically that she had been hearing the word protection while being handed something that protected Rasit much more than it protected her, and once she started describing exactly what she believed she might be giving up, the argument stopped sounding like a simple disagreement over money. According to Mallorie, one of the biggest issues was relocation, because she claimed that their future plans could require her to move, interrupt her work, and restructure her life around the marriage, and she wanted the agreement to recognize that risk instead of pretending both of them would enter and leave the relationship in exactly the same financial position. This is where Rasit became noticeably more defensive, because he did not agree with the idea that Mallorie would somehow be sacrificing more than him. From his perspective, he was also changing his life, he was also taking an emotional risk, and most importantly, he believed he was the person being asked to sign an agreement that could eventually force him to pay for a relationship that no longer existed. That sounds like a fair concern until you hear Mallorie's response, because she was not asking him to financially support her forever. She was saying that if she reorganized her entire life around promises they had made together, there needed to be some protection if those promises disappeared the moment the marriage ended. And this is where the judge started asking questions that made the room much more uncomfortable, because the judge was no longer interested only in the number Mallorie wanted. The judge wanted to know who came up with the original terms when Mallorie received the final version, whether both of them truly understood the consequences, and whether the agreement reflected two people negotiating from equal positions. Rasit clearly did not like where those questions were going, because his position was that none of this should have been surprising to Mallorie. He insisted that they had talked about protecting premarital assets, discussed financial independence, and repeatedly agreed that neither person should enter the marriage expecting to benefit from a breakup. In his mind, Mallorie was not discovering some hidden trap at the last minute. She was changing her position after realizing the protections were more serious on paper than they had sounded during casual conversations. And I can understand why that would frustrate him. Because if you have discussed a financial boundary repeatedly and the other person later says, "Actually, I do not accept this," you are going to wonder whether they ever agreed in the first place. But then Mallorie pushed back with something that changed the tone again. She said talking generally about protecting assets was never the same thing as agreeing that she could reorganize her life around the marriage and then leave with no meaningful safety net. In other words, Rasit thought they had agreed on the principle, while Mallorie believed the actual contract went much further than the principle they had discussed, and that distinction became the crack that the entire argument started falling through. Then came the demand everyone kept circling around, and this was where things got genuinely messy. Mallorie wanted a guaranteed financial provision if the marriage ended after she had made specific sacrifices for the relationship, with the protection increasing depending on how much of her independence she had given up and how long those circumstances lasted. She wanted relocation costs covered if she moved because of the marriage, temporary housing support if separation left her without a stable place to live, and a defined settlement if she had stepped away from her own income while building a life with Rasit. Mallorie's argument was that this was not a reward for divorce. It was protection against being financially punished for trusting the marriage. Rasit heard the exact opposite. To him, once there was a guaranteed payment attached to the end of the relationship, the marriage suddenly had an exit price, and he hated that idea. He kept returning to the same question. If Mallorie believed in them, why was she fighting so aggressively over what she would receive if they separated? Mallorie's response was almost immediate, because she asked why Rasit was fighting so aggressively to make sure she received as little as possible if they separated. And there it was, because both of them were accusing the other person of preparing for divorce, while both of them were literally sitting there negotiating divorce protections. That contradiction appeared to get the judge's attention more than either of them expected, because the judge started pressing on how the agreement had actually been created. Mallorie claimed that several parts changed while negotiations were already emotionally intense, and she suggested that some provisions became more restrictive as the wedding planning became more serious. Rasit strongly disputed the idea that anything had been intentionally hidden from her, saying that she had opportunities to ask questions and could have refused to sign anything she did not understand. But the judge did not appear satisfied with the simple argument that Mallorie should have asked more questions, because there is another issue sitting underneath all of this, whether both people had genuinely independent advice and enough time to understand exactly what they were giving away. Mallorie said she felt pressure because every delay started becoming connected to the future of the wedding, while Rasit insisted nobody had forced her to do anything. And this is where you have to separate pressure from force, because somebody does not need to physically force you into signing something for you to feel like refusing it could destroy the relationship. Mallorie was basically saying that every time she questioned the agreement, the conversation became, "Why are you worried about this if you love me?" And if that is how the negotiations were happening, you can see why the judge wanted to know much more. The next part made Rasit look even more uncomfortable because Mallorie brought up a conversation that apparently happened long before the courtroom dispute became this serious. According to her, Rasit had repeatedly reassured her that she would never be abandoned financially if she changed her life for their marriage, and Mallorie said those promises were one of the reasons she had been willing to discuss relocation and greater dependence in the first place. Rasit immediately challenged the way she was describing that conversation. He did not deny reassuring her, but he argued that telling your partner, "I will take care of you," during a relationship is not the same thing as promising a legally guaranteed settlement after divorce. And actually, that is one of the strongest arguments Rasit made because couples say emotional things all the time that are not written like contracts. The problem for him was that Mallorie was not claiming one romantic sentence suddenly became a legal promise. She was saying those assurances influenced major life decisions, and now the paperwork seemed to remove exactly the security she thought those assurances represented. So once again, they were having two completely different conversations. Rasit was talking about legal obligations, while Mallorie was talking about trust. And then Rasit finally said what he seemed to have been thinking the entire time, because he questioned whether Mallorie's financial demand meant she was already building herself a comfortable escape. That accusation hit much harder than anything about the money itself. Mallorie immediately pushed back and asked him why protecting herself automatically meant she wanted the marriage to fail, especially when he was the person who had insisted on a prenup in the first place. That was probably the strongest point in her favor emotionally, because Rasit wanted his desire for protection to be interpreted as responsible planning, while he was interpreting Mallorie's desire for protection as suspicious. You cannot really have it both ways. If preparing for the worst does not mean Rasit expects divorce, then preparing for the worst cannot automatically mean Mallory expects divorce either. But Rasit had another concern, and this one made the argument less simple, because he said the scale of the protection mattered. According to him, there was a major difference between making sure Mallory could relocate safely after a breakup and guaranteeing enough money that divorce could potentially leave her financially better off than staying independent would have. That is where the disagreement became almost impossible to separate from their personal insecurities. Mallory heard Rasit talking about her like she might be motivated by money, while Rasit felt like Mallory was refusing to understand why that possibility frightened him. He said he had spent too much time thinking about financial stability to enter a marriage where a breakup could create an obligation he considered unpredictable, and Mallory responded that she had spent too much time building her own independence to enter a marriage where she could give that up and then be told she should have protected herself better. That was the entire case in two arguments. Rasit feared being financially trapped inside a bad marriage, while Mallory feared becoming financially trapped by leaving one. Neither fear was completely ridiculous, and that is exactly why this worked so well as a conflict, because there was no obvious villain standing in the room twirling a mustache and demanding everything. Instead, there were two people who supposedly wanted to get married but had completely different definitions of what fairness looked like when love stopped being enough. Then the judge asked Rasit something that seemed simple but changed the entire direction of the hearing. If Mallory's sacrifices were genuinely for the marriage, why should the agreement treat the financial consequences of those sacrifices as entirely her problem? Rasit tried to explain that he was not asking Mallory to stop working forever or become dependent on him, but Mallory immediately jumped on that answer because she said their actual conversations about married life had included exactly the kinds of circumstances he was now minimizing. She claimed there had been discussions about moving, changing work arrangements, potentially focusing more heavily on their household, and making decisions that would place her career behind the relationship for at least some period of time. Rasit answered that none of those plans were guaranteed, which only made Mallory more frustrated because, according to her, that was precisely why she wanted the agreement structured around what actually happened rather than handing her an automatic payout. If she did not relocate, did not lose income, and did not become dependent, then some of those protections would never activate. That detail mattered because it made Mallory's demand sound much less like, "Pay me if we divorce," and much more like, "If I take a measurable financial hit for this marriage, do not leave me carrying all of it afterward." Rasit still refused to accept it that easily, because he argued that once they started calculating compensation for relationship decisions, every sacrifice could eventually become a financial claim. If Mallory moved, would that count? If she changed jobs, would that count? If she chose to work fewer hours, would Rasit later be blamed for that decision? If they disagreed over why she left a job, who would decide whether it was truly for the marriage? Suddenly, the clause that sounded simple became much more complicated, and this was actually a smart moment for the argument because it showed why Rasit was so resistant. He was not only looking at the most sympathetic version of Mallory's demand. He was imagining every future dispute that could come from vague language, and he clearly did not want to sign something that could eventually turn ordinary relationship choices into evidence against him. Mallory then said that was why the clause could be written carefully instead of simply deleted, but by this stage Rasit seemed less interested in fixing the wording and more interested in understanding why she needed the protection so badly. That is when the emotional side of this really started overtaking the legal side, because Rasit asked whether Mallory actually trusted him to take care of her if things ended respectfully. And I have to say, that was a dangerous question for him to ask in a prenup fight, because the entire purpose of putting something in writing is that you do not want to depend on how respectfully everybody behaves after the relationship falls apart. Mallory essentially made that exact point. She said people promise fairness when they love each other, but divorce happens when those feelings have often changed, and she did not want her future security depending on whether Rasit still felt generous toward her after a breakup. That answer seemed to offend him, because he interpreted it as Mallory saying she expected him to become cruel. Mallory said she was not predicting who he would become. She was refusing to gamble her future on it. And suddenly the argument moved from, "Do you trust me?" to the much harder question of whether trust means you should avoid legal protection altogether. The judge then appeared to focus on another major issue, which was the timing of the final agreement. Mallorie said she did not feel that she had been given enough emotional distance from the wedding plans to negotiate without feeling that the entire relationship was sitting behind every clause. Rasit again argued that the wedding should not be used as an excuse, because he had raised the topic of a prenup long before they reached this point. But Mallorie's complaint was not simply that a prenup existed. She said the serious negotiations and specific language became more intense much later, which meant the closer they got to making everything official, the more difficult it felt to say, "I am not comfortable signing this." Rasit believed that was still her responsibility, because in his mind an adult has to be willing to say no to a contract. The judge seemed to understand that argument while still questioning whether the circumstances surrounding the agreement made the supposed choice as clean as Rasit wanted it to sound. And then came the moment that completely changed the balance in the room, because the judge refused to accept Rasit's position that the agreement should simply stand exactly as written. That did not mean Mallorie suddenly received every protection she requested, and this is where the situation became much more interesting than a simple Mallorie wins, Rasit loses storyline. The judge's concern appeared to be that the current agreement had too many unresolved questions surrounding disclosure, negotiation, timing, and fairness to be treated as though every issue had already been settled. Rasit looked genuinely irritated because he had spent most of the hearing defending the document as something both of them understood, only to be told that the document itself was now part of the problem. Mallorie initially seemed relieved, but that relief did not last very long, because the judge immediately made it clear that rejecting Rasit's preferred version did not automatically mean Mallorie's new demand was reasonable either. In other words, the judge was not choosing Mallorie's contract over Rasit's contract. The judge was effectively telling both of them that the deal had become too compromised to solve their trust problem. That distinction matters because Mallorie had apparently expected the fairness concerns to strengthen her demand, but the judge questioned whether her proposed settlement formula could become too broad if it was not tied to clearly measurable sacrifices. Mallorie wanted security, but the court was not going to treat every possible future disappointment as a guaranteed financial loss. Rasit seemed almost relieved by that part, except his relief lasted about 5 seconds because the judge then returned to the original agreement and made it clear that Rasit could not simply use vague language when it benefited him while demanding extreme precision from Mallorie's protections. If the document expected Mallorie to waive certain claims, those waivers needed to be clearly understood. If the agreement depended on financial disclosures, those disclosures needed to be complete. If one person was accepting significantly more risk, there needed to be a reasonable explanation for why. So now both of them were being challenged, and what started as Rasit trying to preserve his prenup had turned into a situation where he might have to reopen the entire negotiation. You could almost see the bigger realization hitting them at the same time. If they renegotiated everything, this was not going to be one uncomfortable conversation followed by a wedding. They would have to sit down again, disclose more information, define what counted as sacrifice, decide how support would work, determine what happened after relocation, and somehow do all of that while pretending the relationship had not just been shaken by everything they said in court. Mallorie had accused Rasit of wanting the benefits of a committed wife without accepting financial responsibility for the sacrifices she might make. Rasit had accused Mallorie of wanting divorce protections so strong that he would question her motivation for getting married. Those are not statements you simply forget because somebody rewrites paragraph 7 of a contract. And this is where the courtroom fight became much more dangerous for the relationship than the actual money, because now both of them knew what the other person feared most. Outside the most intense part of the hearing, Rasit finally gave Mallorie the choice she did not seem prepared to hear. He said that if they could not reach terms both of them genuinely accepted, then they needed to reconsider whether getting married right now made sense at all. Mallorie immediately interpreted that as pressure. From her perspective, she had just spent the hearing explaining why she felt the original negotiations were emotionally loaded, and now Rasit was once again connecting her acceptance of a financial agreement to whether the wedding survived. Rasit denied that he was threatening her. He said marriage was a legal commitment as well as an emotional one, and if they fundamentally disagreed over the obligations created by that commitment, postponing the marriage was more responsible than rushing forward and fighting about it later. And as much as Mallory hated hearing it, that was not an unreasonable point. The problem was the timing, because after everything that had already happened, maybe we should not get married did not sound like neutral financial planning. It sounded like the relationship itself had become another negotiating tool. Mallory then asked Rasit a question that pushed the argument into a much more personal place. She wanted to know whether he would still want the marriage if she refused to sign any prenup at all. Rasit did not answer immediately, and that hesitation seemed to tell Mallory more than any long explanation could have. Eventually, he said he did not believe he would be comfortable entering the marriage without some kind of agreement. Mallory looked disappointed, but not necessarily, because she expected him to abandon the prenup entirely. What seemed to hurt her was realizing that the agreement had become a condition of the marriage itself. She asked whether love was not enough, and Rasit responded that love was exactly why they should settle difficult issues before emotions turned into resentment. Again, neither argument was absurd, but the difference between them was huge. Mallory wanted the prenup to reflect the trust she believed already existed, while Rasit wanted the prenup because he did not believe trust alone was enough protection. Then Mallory changed her approach, and this was probably the biggest surprise of the entire dispute, because instead of doubling down on the original financial number, she said she was willing to reconsider it. That seemed to catch Rasit off guard, because he had spent so much time arguing against the size and structure of her demand that he was prepared for another fight over the figure. Mallory said the exact amount was no longer the most important thing to her. What she wanted was transparency, time, independent advice, and a clear written acknowledgement that if she made specific financial sacrifices for the relationship, she would not be expected to absorb all of the consequences alone. She wanted relocation costs addressed. She wanted a temporary support period if she became dependent and the marriage ended suddenly. She wanted both sides to provide full financial information before anything was signed. Most importantly, she wanted the negotiation separated from the wedding deadline so that disagreeing with one clause did not feel like disagreeing with the marriage itself. That was a much harder position for Rasit to dismiss, because Mallory had just removed the easiest argument against her, which was that she was obsessed with securing a specific amount of money. Now she was saying, fine, let us change the number, but let us also change the process. And if Rasit still refused at that point, the question would become much more uncomfortable for him. Was he objecting to Mallory receiving an excessive settlement, or was he objecting to Mallory having meaningful protection at all? Rasit seemed to understand that because his tone shifted. He said he was willing to discuss relocation support and limited transitional assistance, but he still did not want anything that looked like an automatic reward for the marriage lasting a certain number of years. Mallory said she could accept that conversation as long as the agreement recognized real financial consequences instead of treating every sacrifice as a personal choice that had nothing to do with him. For a moment, it actually sounded like they had finally found the beginning of a compromise, but then Rasit introduced another condition. He wanted any protection for Mallory tied directly to documented changes in her financial situation. If she left a job because they mutually agreed it benefited the marriage, that could be considered. If she moved because of a joint decision, that could be considered. But if she independently decided to reduce her work, spend more, or change careers, Rasit did not want those choices later attached to him. Mallory said that sounded fair in theory, but she immediately questioned who would decide whether a choice had really been mutual after the relationship had fallen apart. If Rasit encouraged her for months to leave a job and then later claimed it had been her decision, how would she prove otherwise? Suddenly they were back inside the exact trust problem they had been trying to solve. Every clause designed to protect one person created another scenario where the other person worried about being manipulated. The judge's reaction to all of this was important because the message was becoming clear. No contract was going to fix a relationship where both people interpreted protection as an accusation. Mallory wanted language strong enough that Rasit could not rewrite their history after separation. Rasit wanted language precise enough that Mallory could not reinterpret ordinary relationship decisions as financial sacrifices. Both of them wanted certainty about a future that was impossible to predict, and the harder they tried to create that certainty, the more suspicious they became of each other. That is why the prenup became such a powerful pressure point. It was not creating their trust issues, it was exposing them. Without the document, Mallory could imagine that Rasit would always take care of her, while Rasit could imagine that Mallory would never expect anything unreasonable from him. The moment they had to define those promises in writing, suddenly both of them wanted limits. Mallory eventually brought the conversation back to what she believed was the emotional heart of the problem. She said she was not afraid of leaving the marriage without becoming rich. She was afraid of leaving the marriage unable to rebuild. She wanted to know that if she moved, lost professional momentum, became dependent for a period, and then suddenly found herself alone, she would have enough stability to restart her life without begging Rasit for help. That distinction clearly mattered to her. She did not want generosity after a breakup. She wanted an obligation decided while both of them still cared about each other. Rasit finally admitted that he understood that fear, but he also said he needed Mallory to understand his. He did not want to spend the marriage wondering whether every financial decision was quietly increasing the cost of leaving. He wanted to know that staying together was always about the relationship and never about what either person might gain or lose financially. And that is when the irony of the entire situation became impossible to ignore, because both of them were asking for the same emotional thing through completely opposite financial positions. Mallory wanted the freedom to stay because she loved Rasit rather than because she could not afford to leave. Rasit wanted the freedom to stay because he loved Mallory rather than because leaving would become financially devastating. They both wanted the marriage to be a choice, but each person's version of freedom threatened the other person's sense of security. Mallory's protection made Rasit worry that leaving would become too expensive. Rasit's protection made Mallory worry that leaving could become financially impossible. Once you understand that, the argument stops being about one greedy demand or one controlling prenup and becomes much more complicated because the exact thing that reassures one person scares the other. Rasit then said something that appeared to change Mallory's expression completely. He told her that even if they reached a new agreement, he was no longer certain they should keep the original wedding timeline. Mallory immediately asked whether he was punishing her for challenging the prenup. Rasit said no, but he admitted that the hearing had revealed issues he did not think they had resolved. He wanted time to understand whether Mallory fundamentally distrusted his intentions, while Mallory said that was almost unbelievable considering she had spent the entire hearing being questioned about whether her own intentions were financial. She asked why Rasit was allowed to become cautious after learning something uncomfortable, while her caution had been treated as proof she did not believe in the marriage. And once again, she had him in a difficult position. Rasit wanted his hesitation to be seen as responsible, but he had spent most of the dispute characterizing her hesitation as suspicious. Mallory then made her final demand, and interestingly, it was not a financial demand at all. She said that before they discussed another dollar, another settlement formula, or another clause, she wanted both of them to complete full financial disclosure and negotiate through independent representation without discussing the wedding date during those conversations. In other words, she wanted the marriage removed from the bargaining table. If Rasit disagreed with a clause, that was a disagreement about the clause. If Mallory refused a provision, that was a refusal of the provision. Neither of them could immediately turn around and say, then maybe we should not get married. Every time the negotiation became uncomfortable. That was actually the smartest demand Mallory made because it targeted the emotional pressure instead of simply demanding more money. Rasit did not reject it, but he also did not give Mallory the reassurance she seemed to want. He agreed that they should exchange more complete information and negotiate the terms carefully, but he refused to promise that the wedding would happen regardless of what those negotiations revealed. From his perspective, that would defeat the purpose of having the conversation. If they discovered that their expectations for marriage were fundamentally incompatible, he believed postponing or canceling the wedding needed to remain an option. Mallory hated that answer, but she could not really force him to promise marriage while simultaneously arguing that both of them needed freedom to make informed decisions. And that is where this story becomes almost painfully balanced, because every time one person makes a reasonable point, the other person finds the weakness inside it. By the end of the hearing, Mallory had achieved something significant because Rasit could no longer treat the original agreement as a finished conversation, but she had not secured the financial guarantee she initially wanted. Rasit avoided being forced into Mallory's preferred settlement structure, but he also lost the certainty he believed his original prenup gave him. The judge's refusal to accept the agreement as though none of these concerns mattered effectively forced both of them back to the beginning, except now they were returning to negotiations with far less trust than they had before. That may be the most damaging outcome possible, because the paperwork can be rewritten, the numbers can be changed, and the clauses can be clarified, but neither of them can forget what the other person said when the relationship was placed under pressure. Mallory now knows that Rasit is willing to question the marriage itself if he feels financially exposed. Rasit now knows that Mallory wants written protection because she does not believe emotional promises alone will protect her after a breakup. Mallory sees his caution as evidence that she was right to protect herself. Rasit sees her caution as evidence that he was right to demand a prenup. Every new development confirms both of their fears at the same time, which is exactly why this conflict refuses to disappear. Even the compromise they are discussing could become another battle, because the next disagreement will not simply be about language. It will be about what that language supposedly reveals about the person asking for it. And now the biggest question is no longer whether Mallory gets a settlement or whether Rasit manages to protect everything he brought into the relationship, because the much bigger question is whether they can sit across from each other after this and still believe they are planning a marriage rather than negotiating a future divorce. They walked into the dispute believing the prenup would create security, but it exposed how differently they define commitment. Mallory believes commitment means nobody should become vulnerable because they trusted the relationship enough to sacrifice. Rasit believes commitment means neither person should need a major financial incentive protecting them from the relationship failing. Both positions sound reasonable when you hear them separately, and almost impossible when you put them together. If Rasit agrees to stronger protections, he may feel like he is entering the marriage under terms he never wanted. If Mallory accepts weaker protections, she may spend the marriage wondering whether she ignored the exact warning signs she fought so hard to explain. If they postpone the wedding, Mallory may see that as punishment for defending herself. If they move forward too quickly, Rasit may feel like they avoided the real problem just to preserve the relationship. There is no clean option anymore, and that is what makes one seemingly simple demand so destructive. The money did not create the crisis. The demand forced both of them to explain what they believed the other person might do if love disappeared, and once somebody tells you exactly how they are protecting themselves from the future version of you, it becomes very difficult to pretend nothing changed. The strangest part is that Mallory and Rasit may actually be closer to a fair agreement now than they were before they entered that courtroom, because they are finally discussing the things both of them avoided when the prenup was only an uncomfortable document sitting between wedding plans. They now know relocation needs to be addressed. They know financial sacrifices need clear definitions. They know disclosures cannot be vague. They know Mallory needs independent security, and they know Rasit needs limits that prevent every future relationship decision from becoming an open-ended financial obligation. On paper, that sounds like progress. Emotionally, however, they may be further apart than ever. Rasit wanted a prenup because he believed clear rules would stop money from damaging the relationship, while Mallory challenged the prenup because she believed those rules already showed how money could damage the relationship. The judge did not magically decide which one of them loved the other person more, because that was never something a document could prove. What the hearing did reveal was much more uncomfortable. Both Mallory and Rasit are afraid of giving the other person enough power to hurt them. Mallory is afraid of financial dependence giving Rasit too much control if the marriage fails. Rasit is afraid of financial obligations giving Mallory too much leverage if the marriage fails. They are trying to promise each other forever while negotiating exactly how protected they need to be from each other if forever does not happen. And that leaves Mallory with a much harder decision than the one she arrived with. She originally wanted the prenup changed so she could feel safe enough to marry Rasit, but now she has to decide whether the way he fought against those changes has made her question the marriage itself. Rasit faces the same problem from the opposite direction, because he wanted the agreement to make him feel safe enough to marry Mallory, but her demand has forced him to wonder whether the financial expectations between them will always become a source of suspicion. The judge may have rejected the agreement they brought into the room, But neither Mallory nor Rasit walked away with a clean victory, because the clause can be rewritten while the accusations behind it cannot be erased nearly as easily. So now they are left with a completely different version of the future they thought they were planning. The next negotiation will not begin with excitement about marriage. It will begin with documents, disclosures, conditions, definitions, and two people studying every sentence for evidence of what the other person might be thinking. Maybe they manage to turn that honesty into something stronger, because sometimes uncomfortable conversations reveal problems early enough to fix them. But maybe the prenup has already done something neither of them expected, because instead of protecting the marriage from a future breakup, it may have exposed the exact conflict capable of causing one before the wedding ever happens.